Oh, hello, come in. Hi, do come through. Sorry, we're returning to chaos again. Come in. You'll have to excuse all the guitars. It's not that I've suddenly been off gigging. I have done one gig, but we had to move them all from the other room because they had to lift up the carpet to do the electrics beneath. So anyway, makes it slightly more difficult to get to those shelves. But come in. I was reflecting on the other day the way books find themselves next to each other, and the way writers whom now we can bring together, whom now we can see as in conversation or even part of the same tradition, as it were, might actually at the time of their writing have been quite opposed to one another. There's a kind of shifting of grounds. There's a beautiful line about that in a couple of lines about that in Eliot's Little Kidding. But here's an example. I won't explore those shelves as the guitars are in the way. So I'm trying to undouble shelf if I can, but looking here, right, this, I think I've shown you this before. This is Herbert's The Temple. It's an exact replica of the 1633 edition. This is my lovely little 3-volume Milton. This is the third volume, Milton's Minor Poems. So, I was reading, here we are, from The Temple. This is a 19th century exact reproduction. This was in 1876, but of course the original book was 1633. Shows you. I was reading this very beautiful poem on time by Herbert, and I'll read it to you in a minute. But I thought to myself, there's another really fine poem on time by Milton, which is a similar paradox in it, which is about actually time that seems to be the destroyer is the time that will eventually come. This great Advent theme, the coming of the one. The time will bring the time when time itself opens into eternity and we have the fullness of time. And I thought, you know, Milton said something very similar. I wonder when he did it. So I looked up, I went and found, this is beautiful, look at this, look at the marbled paper on this. This is a lovely, sumptuous binding from William Pickering, who are the same people who published, in the 19th century, published Coleridge. This is 1832, this was published. But I looked up Milton's, obviously it's a 19th century edition of the 17th century poet, but I looked up Milton's Ode on Time, and I knew it had been written in order to be written on a clock. But when I looked it up a bit further, I discovered that it was written by Milton in 1633, which is exactly the same year that, admittedly in the year that he died, that Herbert's poem was published. So you've got these two poems on time at the same time, as it were. And yet, when you think about what happened, that's 1633, right? This is published, this is written 1633. We were just beginning to build into those desperate, dark, difficult divisions that eventually issued in our Civil War. And although Herbert died before that Civil War started, he was very much part of, if you like, the more, in inverted commas, Catholic end, the more sacramental end, the sense of the church continuing its older traditions, which was on one side of the Civil War. And Milton was very much on the Puritan side. So, I mean, had Herbert survived, these men would have been in opposing camps, perhaps violently opposing camps. And yet here they are, serving a sort of common poetic tradition. So anyway, I just thought it would be fun to just read the two poems. So we'll start with the Herbert, which was certainly written earlier, although curiously enough, published in the same year that Milton wrote his poem. Herbert has this brilliant thing in this poem where he takes the traditional figure of time as the sort of almost skeletal figure with a sigh, like old Father Time, at Lord's, and says, "Oh no, the resurrection has changed the way we look at you." So it's a wonderful thing where he upbraids time. So, Time by George Herbert. "Meeting with time, slack thing," said I. "Thy scyther's dull, whet it for shame." "No marvel, sir," he did reply, if it at length deserves some blame. For where one man would have me grind it, 20 for one too sharp to find it. Perhaps some such of old did pass, who above all things loved this life, to whom thy scythe a hatchet was, which now is but a pruning knife. Christ's coming hath made man thy debtor, since by thy cutting he grows better. And in his blessing thou art blessed. For where thou only wert before an executioner at best, thou art a gardener now, and more, an usher, to convey our souls beyond the utmost stars and poles. And this is that makes life so long, while it detains us from our God. Even pleasures here increase the wrong, and length of days lengthen the rod. Who wants the place where God doth dwell, partakes already half of hell. Of what strange length must that needs be, which even eternity excludes? Thus far time heard me patiently, then chafing said, "Ha! This man deludes. What do I hear before his door? He doth not crave less time, but more." That's just a brilliant poem. I love the idea that the executioner turned into the gardener and the usher and upbraiding time. So there's this poem. And of course it wouldn't have been, it's just possible, I suppose, that Milton got a first copy of this as soon as it came out, and it was around when he was composing in 1633 his own poem. It's unlikely. But here they were, two young men, comparatively young men, meditating on the passage of time, but seeing buried within the passage of time, because of the coming of Christ and the resurrection, a promise of eternity. So this is Milton's poem, and he addresses time itself exactly as Herbert does. Herbert says, "Meeting with time, slack thing," said I, whet thy scythe. Now, really, Milton's telling time to get packing, but this would have been written on a clock, and it would have been one of those old clocks where you'd have heard the leaden pendulum swinging back and forth, and that's alluded to. Here's Milton's poem on time. "Fly, envious time, till thou run out thy race. Call on thy lazy, leaden stepping hours, whose speed is but the heavy plummet's pace, and glut thyself with what thy womb devours, which is no more than what is false and vain, and merely mortal dross. So little is our loss, so little is thy gain. For when, as each thing bad thou hast entombed, and last of all thy greedy self consumed, then long eternity shall greet our bliss with an individual kiss, and joy shall overtake us as a flood, when everything that is sincerely good and perfectly divine, with truth and peace and love, shall ever shine about the supreme throne of him, to whose happy making sight alone, when once our heavenly guided soul shall climb, then all this earthly grossness quit. Attired with stars, we shall forever sit, triumphing over death and chance and thee, O time." Just the movement of that poem is so good. The lovely thing about, whose speed is but the heavy plummet's pace. You can hear it ticking away. And then this idea that what's going to happen beyond time. Time can eat up everything, and then time will eventually eat itself, as it were, its greedy self-consume. And then the poem lifts, it's just so beautiful. "And long eternity shall greet our bliss with an individual kiss. I love the idea. It's the big concept of eternity, but we don't lose our personhood in it. The welcoming into the joys of heaven, an individual kiss, and then joy shall overtake us as a flood. And then the idea that everything that is truly good will flourish, and we will be in that happy-making sight. I mean, people think of Milton largely because they think of the later Milton and blind Milton and his Milton in his old age as this sort of dour person. But Milton's got the same lithe, lively, flexible delight in and joy in his very language that Herbert has. I mean, Milton at that stage could have gone a different direction and, you know, been a metaphysical poet like Herbert. So anyway, I had those two books. I was thinking about them, and it made me think of a third poet, and maybe I can step over the guitar. So take a look at this. This is really interesting. So everybody knows Eliot's 4 quartets, and nowadays, you know, you buy them in a little volume like this, or that's Maggie's one, or you read them in a big collected Eliot. But originally, here they all are. They came out as separate poems which weren't yet gathered into it, and the last one, Little Gidding, was published in the war. This is it's a first edition, but it's a second impression. Look at this lovely, lovely old paper. This is the Ravages of Time. So there we are, Little Gidding by T.S. Eliot, Faber and Faber, first published 1942. Second impression, March 1943. So what I was thinking of was this this remarkable bit about where Eliot is thinking about Milton and other poets, but poets on the other side as well, and he's thinking about how, although they opposed each other, they're folded together now. Not only folded together in the, if you like, in the kingdom of death, in the grave, but ultimately rejoicing together in heaven, but also kind of folded together in our minds. They sit next to each other on my shelf. So this is what Eliot says. These men, and those who opposed them, and those whom they opposed, accept the constitution of silence and are folded in a single party. Whatever we inherit from the fortunate, we have taken from the defeated, what they had to leave us, a symbol perfected in death, and all shall be well, and all manner of thing shall be well. He's quoting Julian of Norwich there, but in a sense he's coming to a similar conclusion that these two poets did. So there's a kind of wonderful three-way conversation going on with the books in my hand. And I'll tell you what I was thinking. I mean, I think it struck me because we are living in such polarised and divided times. And I wonder, you know, I mean, almost to the point in some countries where you feel we're almost coming to the brink of civil war again, as we did in the 17th century. And I'm wondering if there are contemporary writers right now who are opposed to one another, who see themselves in different factions or different parties, who couldn't imagine a reconciliation, each writing from their perspective. But whether a later perspective, 100 years later, they won't sit beside each other on someone's shelf, and somebody else in the future will say they each had something to say, they each had something to offer. Between them, they opened out a larger whole of which they were parts. Maybe some of the writers who oppose one another now could reflect on that, and we could have a little less adversarial and a little more constructive conversation. But there we go. Anyway, thanks for dropping by.